Now, I got inundated with articles after articles about container homes and container apartments and how great they are because they're so cheap. And if the government would just make container apartments, it would solve low income housing problem. I mean, so many people are going to be able to afford these things. It looks a little bit like the communist brutal architecture where you stack people in matchbox houses. But hey, at least you're going to solve the homeless problem, right? Because there's going to be less people that are homeless and more people that are being placed into these atrocities. And, they don't have to look like an eyesore. I mean, I saw a couple of models that, well, they look quite artsy. And it might happen to be that some teenager that just finished gender studies might want to move into one of these things, right? So maybe they want to protect the environment because I also heard they're eco-friendly. And I actually spoke with the person that's into construction in Romania, and he started laughing his ass off as I told him about it. It's like, there is no way. Like, he doesn't believe. Okay, I talked with an expert. He doesn't believe that it's actually cheaper than, let's say, building a small house made out of wood. Because what a lot of people do is they look at a house that's made out of wood and the house is large and they use the same price for that house, and then they look at how much a container housing costs and they're like, oh, look, well, the container is cheaper, right? And they also lie to you if you go on these websites and they will say, well, yeah, but like a container is cost effective, right? Because a house can cost all the way up to 35,000, but the container costs 1,000 to 5,000. And they don't talk about the price that you are going to have to add for modification, which we're going to talk in a bit. And then they can also talk about the durability on top of this. And they say a container is more durable than a wooden house. And we're going to talk about that in a bit. So just go with the container because it's cheaper, but they don't take into account the size difference. So I don't know if they don't do this out of malice or they just dumb, but when you look at a container, like if you just take the container and you live in it, yeah, sure, it's cheaper. But the problem is no one does that. I mean, you can't do that. It's impossible. Like when you buy a container, what you need to do is, well, you need to carve out some windows and you need to carve out a door. And this ruins the structural integrity of the container, which means that you now have to reinforce it. So when you reinforce it, well, you need to use steel, you need to use wood, you need to use different materials. And then all of a sudden you realize that the pricing is going up. Now, if you want an artsy style for your containers, that also costs money. The containers are designed to be stacked on top of each other, not to have any artsy style, because again, that destroys the structural integrity of the thing. So when you have the artsy style, you need to reinforce it with steel, you need to reinforce it with various other things, which costs money. And then, of course, you need to insulate it, regardless of where you are. Now, if you have a wooden house in certain climates, maybe you don't have to insulate them. But with the containers, you have to insulate them no matter what, because steel, as you know, it's not a very good place to live in. So you need to add money for the insulation. And what usually happens, and I've seen this on the internet a lot of times with people that bought these, is because of the difference of temperature inside being much warmer than outside, or vice versa after the insulation is done, you're going to end up with mold, you're going to end up with leakage, and you're going to end up with health problems. Health costs pills, pills cost money, and there you go. Again, like I noticed this with a lot of people that ended up buying a container home. And they're all saying the same thing. It's like there's mold. Now, I'm pretty sure they can spend more money and more time to make sure there is no mold. But the goal here is to make sure that it's cheap, right? It's not to make sure that you're constantly doing maintenance for your little house. No, the goal is to make sure that it's cheap and affordable. So that's clearly another problem. Now, when you look at it, it's already small. I mean, you look at a container, right? It's not very big. And take into account that all the modifications that you're going to have, like the plumbing, the electricity, you're going to have to install fake walls. You're going to install a fake roof. You're going to have to install a fake floor. All of that shrinks the already small space. So you're going to be living in a much smaller area than you initially thought. So all in all, like what I'm trying to say is that it's not so cheap, and I don't know how eco-friendly it is, considering the fact that the container is made out of steel, and if you just buy a house that's made out of wood, that doesn't cost as much CO2 as the container. Because this is a little bit interesting, okay? If you're for protecting the environment, you need to stop thinking like you did in the 90s. In the 90s, people were encouraging you to buy a plastic bag to save the forest. The forest was the most important. Nowadays, fuck the forest, the carbon is the most important. So you need to dump your plastic bag and you need to start caring about the carbon. So you need to have a new mindset, okay? That's how science works. You need to constantly get re-educated into the new mindset. So while it may seem that you're buying a container in order to save the forest can go fuck itself because now it's all about the carbon, steel, dangerous, carbon, okay? So that's one of the issues. And finally, another thing which also you need to take into account when it comes to pricing, it's going to be cheaper to have a container house if you're somewhere next to the sea because the transportation is going to not cost very much. But if you're inland and you happen to live next to a factory that makes wood, make the house out of wood. So all in all, like living in a wood house, in my opinion, on the same size as a container is a lot cheaper and you're going to have less trouble and less hassle. But again, I'm not even sure human beings are meant to live like this. Consider the depression of living in a place that's as a matchbox. I mean, especially if you want to have a family and kids. I would personally try to avoid it. I mean, the Americans keep having us say it's like living in your mother's basement. I would rather live in my mother's basement than live into this, to be honest. But, that's just me. Again, it reminds me of the communist brutal architecture where everyone gets to fit in a matchbox. I mean, yeah, sure, everyone gets to have a home, but they don't really explain what a home is. And again, I'm a little bit worried about the structural integrity of these things. Because again, like they're not being built, they're not being designed for people to live in. They're being designed to carry goods across the sea. That's why the containers are there. Not to mention, like, you don't even know what they carried. Did they carry some dangerous substances? You don't know where they've been. You don't know anything. So, I mean, that's just one of the concerns, I suppose. But it's still one of the things you should take into account. Now, if you really want to recycle containers, you can use them as a tool shed. I mean, you can have a hole in the ground if you really want to, right? You put the container in there, and that's a place where you can hold the pickles. That's the place where you can tinker if you enjoy doing that, if you enjoy having a workshop and creating various things. That's a place where you can have a studio. You can do a lot of things with the container, but like living in it, sure, okay, but it's not as cheap as they're advertising. Take into account it's probably a lot more expensive after you're done with all the modifications. But hey, maybe I'm wrong. Let me know what you think. I'm really interested in seeing it. If you happen to live in a container, do tell me if you would rather live in a house made out of wood for pretty much the same the same space. And I'll see you guys in the comment section. Take care.